This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 455, Top 5 Uses of AI for Drupal. On today's show, we're talking about AI tips for Drupal devs, AI best practices, and Drupal Droid with guest Mike Miles. We'll also cover AI Interpolator as our module of the week. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Today, our guest is Mike Miles. Mike Miles is the Director of Web Development at MIT Sloan, leading the development, maintenance, and growth of the public digital properties for the school and the team that supports them. He has been working as a web engineer since 2003 and with Drupal since 2008. He is a regular contributor to the Drupal community. He is one of the organizers of the New England Drupal Camp and an advisory member of the Event Organizers Working Group. Mike, welcome back to the show, and thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me again.
Absolutely. I am John Picozzi, Solutions Architect at EPAM, and today my co-hosts are Randy Fay, Lead Maintainer at DDev.
Good to see you today.
And last but certainly not least, Nick Laughlin, Founder at Enlightened Development.
Happy to be here. Really excited about today's show and today's module of the week.
AI all around. So let's get to our module of the week and bring in Martin Anderson-Klutz, a Senior Solutions Engineer at Acquia and a maintainer of a number of Drupal modules and recipes of his own. Martin, what do you have for us this week?
Thanks, John. Have you ever wanted to use AI to help populate entity fields that were left blank by Drupal content authors? There's a module for that. It's called AI Interpolator and was created in September of 2023 by Marcus Johansson of FreelyGive. It has a 1.0.0 RC4 version available, which is actively maintained because that was released in just the past month. It does also have a security coverage, or that's to say, again, it's opted into security coverage, but won't technically have that until there's a stable release. It does have test coverage and a user guide for documentation. And there are 18 open issues, none of which are bugs. And according to Drupal.org, the module is currently in use by 94 Drupal sites. Now, in scientific fields, interpolation is the process of using known data to extrapolate or estimate unknown data points. And in a similar way, this module helps your Drupal site provide values for fields that didn't receive input based on the information that was provided. Fundamentally, Interpolator AI provides a framework and an API and then relies on companion modules for processing, either by leveraging third-party services like AI large language models or PHP-based scripting. There are existing integrations with a variety of AI services, including OpenAI, Dream Studio, Hugging Face, and more. You can add retrievers to help extract and normalize the content you're processing, for example, photos from an external site, and other tools to help normalize and optimize the content and media, as well as optimize any prompts that you will be using with AI services. You can also extend the workflow capabilities of AI Interpolator, for example, using the popular and powerful ECA module that we've talked about previously on this show. But let's talk about AI Interpolator. And maybe, Nick, why don't we start with you, since I gather you've actually used this one yourself.
Yeah, so I've been using this module. It's not in production yet, but I've been using this module for a client for about a month, I think, maybe a month and a half. And I have to say, this module is great. Well, I should say this suite of modules is great. Really, what it allows you to do is on a per field basis, you can create AI rules, right? So, or integrations with some of these tools. So for example, one of the tools that we're using on this project is we're getting we're uploading files and we need to take the data from that file and then we need to parse it using AI. We're trying to collate some data based on files. And so the first thing that we do is we use integration with Unstructured, which is a API that basically will take any PDF, any kind of document that you can throw at it, or at least that I've thrown at it so far, and convert it to either HTML or Markdown or plain text. And then you can, run some sort of AI tool on that field and get the output that you want. I have to say, it is RC. So I think when I started using it, it was beta, maybe alpha. So there were certainly some rough edges, but Marcus is super responsive. He was very, very helpful with providing some updates. I would say there are a couple of fairly minor limitations. So, for example, it doesn't have yet, although I suspect this will come at some point, it doesn't yet have an easy way to swap out backends for individual rule sets. So, for example, you can very easily switch from using ChatGPT to using Fireworks AI, but then you have to go to each field and kind of reconfigure it to use the different endpoints, right? You can't just, like with Augmentor, I think you can kind of just check a couple boxes and we'll use a different one. That being said, I also think it's really important to mention that a lot of the people behind a lot of the AI tools in Drupal.org right now are collaborating together on the new AI namespace. So it's very likely that this specific module will go away shortly, but a lot of stuff that this does, as well as I think the module that Kevin Quillen works on, and I don't want to speak for you, Martin, but I suspect the Augmentor AI team will probably start moving over there as well. This module itself will probably go away, but a lot of the tooling that went into it will move over. Before I open it up, there's one other thing that really impressed me. Like every time I wanted to do something, it kind of just did it. Like you can provide weights. So, for example, we have a workflow set up where you upload a file. When the system sees that file exists, it runs one process. When it sees that field get filled out, it runs another process. And then when it sees that field fill out, it can do another. And you can set weights to these, and you can set it up to use a batch. You can set it up to do it on save. You can set it up to do it with a queue, right? If you do a queue, you obviously have to have a queue processor, but like it's so flexible and it's pretty intuitive. I mean, it's complex. It's definitely at the level of like ECA for like initial setup and that kind of thing. But once you figure it out, it's not unnecessarily complex. It's complex because it's solving a complex problem. But I think it's a great module. I'm a huge fan. It solved the problem for us that we were starting to build kind of manually in hours or days that we were planning on spending weeks, if not months, kind of manually building.
I want to just quickly follow up on what you just said, Nick, which is to say, I've noticed that in the AI Interpolator issue queue, Marcus has already been referring to basically that AI module as like version 2 of this one. So, I think it's pretty clear that, his intent is to shift focus over there, and that's going to be the place where you'll see major improvements on the current functionality.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that brings us to the end of our show. Mike, where can folks... Just kidding. So let me throw a scenario out there, and Martin and Nick, you can tell me if this module is capable of helping in this, right? So like I make a blog post and I really despise creating images for my blog post. Like, can I type my blog post out, hit save, and be like, and have it just go and like generate an AI image and put it into the content for me? Or into a field for the blog image for me?
Yeah. Yep, you can. So at least that's my understanding that you can. If you can't with this one, I know that you can with Augmentor in the OpenAI module.
No, that's one of the actual examples.
I'm pretty sure this one can too.
Example.
Clearly, I didn't look at the module page for this before I asked that. But
unless you're Nick, you need to reserve more than an hour or two to get through the beginning of this use of this. I only had an hour or two, and I tried the simplest things, and I did not succeed. That, of course, is a common experience for all of us with complex situations of all types, but it does take some time. I couldn't figure out, and maybe Nick, you can help me. How do you figure out what's going wrong when something goes wrong? I mean, like I got no results at all.
I would suspect that the first place to look for you're integrating with services. So the first thing I would suspect is, do you have most of these services are paid accounts? So if you don't have a paid account, you can't get an API key.
My open API key was in there and accepted, so I could use, and it's a paid account. So that was, everything was acting like that was okay.
Yeah, so that's the first thing. The second thing is these are, and this was the piece that was a little bit unique that took some effort. This is triggered off of a base field, which is not the same as a base field in Drupal terms, and I don't know, a target field, I guess you would say. So for example, you would have a body field, and then you would have an image field. And when you edit the image field, you would then configure it and say, when somebody fills in the body field, take this information and generate an image for it. And you have to put that in the prompt, but you also have to make sure you pass the context. Like I said, it definitely could use a passive UX. It took a fair amount of effort, but like I said, once it clicked, things just kind of started working. But like I said, the biggest problem that I found with it is it's really difficult, and I don't know how you solve this, but it's really difficult to iterate, because many times when you're trying to for example, when you're trying to figure out the correct prompt for something, you end up wanting to run that prompt over and over and over again. And in this case, the prompt is part of the field settings. So you end up having to edit the field settings and then go edit a piece of content to see if it generates properly. So the development loop, I mean, I'm aware of the playground, so we ended up using that as well. But when you're moving from the playground to Drupal, that feedback loop was slower than I think would be ideal. But hopefully now that a bunch of different AI teams in the Drupal world are working together, maybe that can be improved upon.
He has a website called Workflows of AI that kind of points you in the directions of all the different things that you could do. It's kind of a search and figure out what you could use, but it's an interesting approach to trying to make these possibilities more accessible.
Yeah, he has dozens of videos that are worth looking up just to see like the kinds of things that you can do with it. Like some proof of concepts that he wrote just completely blew my mind. Like he has a proof of concept module where you upload a screenshot of a component you want, and it generates the paragraph fields for you automatically. And he built it based on Bootstrap, so it builds the Bootstrap styles for you, and then gives you kind of like a point and click system for like adding things like animations and things like that. And it just like he wrote that proof of concept in the beginning of the year. I think it was like 7-8 months ago. Like completely mind-blowing stuff that I think very much should be part of Starshot, which I think he's interested in connecting with as well. But I have to say, the things that this module can do and the things that Marcus has been prototyping are just mind-blowing. And it's one of the, I think it's going to be one of the things that allows Drupal to continue to differentiate itself in the world of AI. Not to take too much away from the show itself today, but because Drupal has a really well-defined configuration system, AI can parse that and understand it in ways that it can't. Yeah, you can build a site with AI today using Wix or something, but wholesale systems or like content systems are really difficult. Whereas AI understands Drupal YAML, it can build web forms through a chat interface, and then you can deploy those. So I'm just seeing some of the videos that Marcus has put together. Your mind will be blown.
And
I think
again, that module was AI Interpolator.
Yep.
For anybody that may have lost track. What were you going to say, Martin?
I was just going to say, I believe I've heard that Marcus also has a proof of concept where you can upload a hand-drawn sketch of the web form, and it'll, build out the YAML and create that as an entity for you.
Wow. The one the web form one I saw was the chat interface, but it was just not only did it build it for him, like he could like he's like, hey, I need a web form that does this thing. It built it for him like, okay, I need to be on this URL and I need to do this. Oh, you missed this thing. Please add this question. And it just generates it. And it's not like hacking together PHP. It's using web form, like the best form module on the planet, I think, right? And then you can just export that config and
Core contact forms just died a little bit inside. I'm not going to lie.
I mean, core contact form has a place, but web form solves a whole nother problem. So yeah, I think some of those demos are some of the most mind-blowing stuff that I've ever seen.
So before we move on, Does anybody else, when hearing the name Hugging Face, just think of one of those aliens from Aliens?
Totally.
Yes, everybody's shaking their heads. Okay, cool. I'm not the only one. Perfect. Wonderful. So, very topical module. Obviously, we have a lot of strong feelings about it. I suggest you go try it out yourself. Martin, if folks wanted to connect, suggest a module, chit chat about this module, how could they go about doing that?
We're always happy to chat about or receive nominations for the module of the week in the Talking Drupal channel of Drupal Slack. And folks can also reach out to me directly as ManClue on all the Drupal and social platforms.
Fabulous. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Okay, Mike Miles. So you, sir, have talked at a couple of conferences about AI. And I think the last one that I saw you at may have been, maybe was it Nerd Summit? Were you at Nerd Summit?
I was, yeah. Nerd Summit was the last one where I actually had a presentation spot on it. I did at the Higher Ed Summit at DrupalCon. We had a speaker who couldn't make it, so I did an abbreviated version of using AI.
So in that talk, I remember thinking, oh, we should bring Mike on to talk about this, because you kind of have like, the 5 top areas, or tip areas that you talked about. I'm wondering if you can kind of just give an overview of what those areas are, and then we'll ask some more in-depth questions to get into each of those areas as we go.
Yeah, and these areas have evolved over time. And so if you see in my presentations, when I give them, which is the fun about this topic, is that I have to update them and change them. So currently, I would say it's idea generation, code generation, debugging, content generation, and helping with technical explanations.
Okay, so how do you suggest that people use AI for ideation?
So one of the ways, especially with Drupal, is there's a million ways to do things in Drupal. And so one of the ways I think people can use it for idea generation is when you're trying to solve a problem, to ask the AI, like, what are different ways I can do this and what are the pros and cons? Because that takes a lot of mental strain off of you as a developer or as a Drupal team for thinking through all those architecture things, like, and knowing which path to take or not knowing which path to take. So that's where I like to start with it.
So I'm gonna jump in with a follow-up there, but how do you know, like, if you ask AI, like, hey, how do I architect, or how do I do this thing, right? Or like, hey, I have an idea for this. Can you give me a way to do it? How do you know if it's the right way, the best way, a good way, or if it's not just going to end up in like disaster?
Well, I mean, I think that's a loaded question, because most of the time the best way or the right way is based on the context of like what you're trying to achieve. There's no one best way. So I think it's all in terms of the specifics of the problem or the goal you're trying to achieve. Right? We all build our Drupal projects for certain goals. And
Right.
so the best way is how you deliver that. And so even just having AI give you additional options can help you with that.
I have found that sometimes I probably have a way in mind, and I make I ask AI for a suggestion, and I'll get to see a new technique, and it may or may not be useful or best or even correct. You can never believe a thing it says, but when it sends you in a way that you might not have had on your roadmap, or your vision did not include that way, then you have a win. You can exclude it, but you have a win.
Yeah. I think that highlights one of my biggest fears, actually, because I think evaluating and solving problems is a skill. And I worry that as AI gets better at making suggestions, as you begin to trust it more, those skills won't be as honed. And so when they do, like right now, I think AI fails at least as often as it succeeds when I'm asking questions, if not fails more often. So I'm very quick to discard. But as it gets better, you start to trust it more. I'm worried about the time where I go really far down a path, believing it, and then finding out, okay, this was not the way to go. So one of the things I've been considering is like, how do you keep those evaluation tools sharp in that world?
I think it still comes down to experience, because if you're asking like an AI tool, say like ChatGPT or the Drupal Droid, how to solve a certain Drupal problem, like I need to make a authenticated post request and parse the JSON data. How can I do that? Give me 3 ways. Like it can give you 3 ways really quickly and list out pros and cons for each one. And so it doesn't take a lot of time for it to come up with these different methods that then you can choose from. And once you implement that, you could realize like, oh, this was not a good way to do it. And you have that built up knowledge. So next time you could be like, all right, give me 4 more ways. And so it's a quick way to get a number of avenues versus spending a whole day thinking through like 2 possible scenarios.
Yeah. So I think Nick said something. Well, so Mike, I think you nailed it, hit the nail on the head there. But I think Nick also said something interesting, right? So like you need kind of like the experience, right? And that experience is valuable. So I mean, like I see this. It's funny you guys are talking about this. And as I see it, I'm like, I see my job as an architect becoming more complicated, because in this example, right? Like I could ask Drupal Droid or, any AI, right, to give me some ideas on how to solve a problem, right? And, then I can get those 5 things and kind of look through them and go, yeah, that one makes sense. Oh, I want to try this one and this one and see what happens, right? So it can be like a sounding board almost. But then I kind of see it also as, from an architect standpoint, having to kind of defend a solution or fight off some of the bad responses that somebody might get, because I could see a client or somebody that's less experienced going and asking us a similar question of like, how would I do this in Drupal? And it providing those 5 and going like, hey, why didn't we do this? Or why didn't we do that? Or why didn't we do this? So like, you may be put in a position where you kind of have to say, well, we didn't do this one because of X, Y, and Z, and we didn't do that one because of this. We did this one, and then we POC'd that one, and it didn't work, right? So it may kind of keep you more on your toes as an architect, I think.
We can hope. I think those toes might be getting worn out. Mike, at MIT Sloan, are you folks using AI to help with Drupal development, and how?
Yeah, so my team, we are using some AI tools to help with our Drupal development. The one we use the most, we're using GitHub Copilot, and my team is using that to help with code generation, or even just with help with idea generation as well, using their VS Code plugin. So I have a number of different experiences for people on my team and how experienced they are with Drupal. And so it's helpful when they need to figure out, what hook should I use to accomplish X, Y, or Z? They can ask Copilot in VS Code what hooks are available, and it can tell them, and then they can use that to help prompt how to start writing out that code in like our custom code, or even with like optimizing our CSS. So it's been helpful to cut down the amount of time it takes to research those things and implement them.
Would you say for the lower experienced developers, have you noticed a difference in code reviews? Like, do you find you're making more comments, less comments? Is it like, are you noticing weird AI generated artifacts or paths that you wouldn't expect, or is it actually helping, or is it helping because it's reducing the amount of times that the junior developers have to ask a senior for help?
It does help reduce that. There's a reduction in the amount of time my team reaches out to me to ask for help, which I'm always happy to help them. But they have these tools that this like the Drupal Droid or ChatGPT or GitHub Copilot, like it has way more knowledge than I do, or it's consumed a lot more knowledge, I should say. And so they have to turn to me less. And when I'm reviewing their code, it's what's cool about the VS Code plugin for GitHub Copilot is that you can write a code comment and it acts as a prompt. So our code is becoming self-documented, because if you're using the prompt to generate your code, you have to leave it as a comment. So I can see that in the code review, and I'd be like, oh, they had help filling this out. You do still get some ancillary code in there, and you can say like, oh, you should get rid of this. This is not needed. But
so I guess that leads me to my next question here, as far as like if they're using AI to generate code, it sounds like that code is not going directly into your final product. It's going through code review, and people are kind of banging the tires on it to make sure that it's not doing something malicious or doing something stupid.
Yeah, and I think that's we have a robust regression testing in place, and linting and whatnot. And I'd say it's in general, anytime you're writing custom code, you should, if you can, write a unit test for it that tests that. But that's a big concern, is security for this AI generated code, and it doesn't guarantee it's writing secure code for you.
Is it? I mean, it doesn't sound like you guys are using it in like a large capacity, like, oh, it's writing a whole module for us. It's more like it's writing, maybe a form alter or some sort of smaller piece of code that's kind of easily reviewable. Is that pretty accurate?
Yeah. We use it in these smaller custom code chunks.
I'm curious, you're kind of in a unique position because you work at an organization that has one of the more famous licenses on the internet, the MIT license. I don't know if people have heard of that.
Wait, it's that MIT?
Yeah. I'm curious what their stance is on licensing this type of code, because I mean, I've heard from other teams that there's a lot of concern about using it, just because even though, ChatGPT and I assume Copilot said that they won't make a claim, it's still a question of whether or not that code is copywritten or licensable, because a human didn't generate it.
And before Mike answers, I'd just like to say that he is not a lawyer or an expert in law. So
yeah,
go
this
ahead,
is
Mike.
not legal advice. But I mean, I've given that sort of warning in my talks as well, is that because we don't know what the AI output, where all it's getting its knowledge from, and how much you trust it, you don't know the licensing for the code. I mean, in the US, anything that AI generates is you can't copyright it. So if you put that and this doesn't matter too much for Drupal development, but if you put it into a private source, closed source code base, like all of a sudden your code is parts of code that you can't copyright in your copyrighted code base. How does that jive? I don't know. But from an MIT Sloan perspective, and even an MIT perspective, like, there's a lot more smarter people than me who work there, and they've written out like guidelines on how to use AI tools, for faculty, for staff, and across the institute. And for the MIT Sloan policies, I helped a little bit, just a small smidgen of how we could use it for code generation and what we're allowed to do. Like, we can't just copy and paste what Copilot gives us and put it in our final code base without reviewing it, because we don't we own everything that comes out of there.
Are those guidelines public by any chance? Or
they might be. Most of the things that MIT produces is available publicly. But I don't know off the top of my head if it is or not.
Things that I keep running into is, because AI is eating everything that there is on the internet, it's eating all kinds of things that are out of date, or they're just not true anymore. And some of them work, so you'll find it suggests things that actually, like an environment variable that has been long deprecated but doesn't do any harm. But AI sure knows about it, and it puts it in there, and it doesn't do any harm to use it, but it just clogs up the works, and those are annoying things.
Yeah, that goes back to Mike's mention, though, of using good linting and analysis tools and stuff. Because actually, I had that issue maybe 2 weeks ago. I asked ChatGPT for some help with something. It gave me a suggestion. I put it in. It worked. And then PHP Stan immediately threw a bunch of messages. I think it was PHP Stan about deprecations. But then I was able to go back to ChatGPT and be like, that's deprecated. Give me the right one. And then it spit out the updated implementation. It was almost drop in and replace. But
That's a
yeah,
good point,
go ahead.
Nick, because so another pitfall, especially for junior developers, is they don't have that knowledge to be like, this is deprecated code. They may not know how to
Yeah.
look at it, and that's a challenge. There is trusting what it gives you, and versus a senior developer who's like, you can look at the code, be like, oh, that's Drupal 8 code. I'm working on a Drupal 10 website. Like that's
Does
that's not going to work.
Does it have good version contextual awareness, Mike? Like if you were to say like, no, I need a Drupal 10 version of this, or no, I need a Drupal 11 version of this, like could it differentiate?
I've had to differentiate, like for when I've asked questions for like Drupal 9 or 10 specific, it's been all right, but it's all based on what it's consumed. So if, in terms of this, we're thinking, say like the, Drupal.org's content. So it's using all that. And it's like, these are the most common ways I should answer this. And so it's not necessarily, you have to give it the right context in your prompt.
Yeah. So for example, I think one of the other things to keep in mind is like, I think GPT 3.5, for example, doesn't have the Drupal 10 documentation just because the date that it consumed last was before Drupal 10 came out, but 4.0 does have it. So 4.0, aside from being generally better, also has newer information. They also do have the new feature that they released, I don't know, 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, where it can access the internet. So if you need something really up to date, you can make those requests. But I found that to be slower and buggier than other tools.
I'm feeling like a common thread is being sown here, where it's like, yes, you can use AI in all of these ways that we're suggesting, but you still need to have some base set of knowledge to be able to use it effectively, right? You can't just blanketly say like, oh, I'm going to take what it's telling me and like, use it or do it or whatever that is, right?
If you can't test it, you have no business fiddling with it. If you can't evaluate and test and run what it gives you, you are in hell.
One of the reasons too, just to give my philosophy on this, one of the reasons why I've been forcing myself to use AI consistently for the last little bit. And one of the reasons for that is I believe an important skill is going to kind of have to build a sixth sense on whether or not you're getting truthful or semi-truthful information back from AI. So for example, like it's a skill, maybe it doesn't feel like a skill, but I truly believe that it's a skill to be able to look at a Stack Overflow issue quickly and realize whether or not it's valuable information or not. It's different because it's generally humans writing that stuff, and maybe not anymore, but it was generally humans writing that stuff. I believe that same level of intuition, you're going to need to build those same types of skills for both detecting and understanding whether or not AI is hallucinating or not, because the real value of AI is getting it on the edge of your knowledge. But if it's on the edge of your knowledge, then it's hard for you to know whether or not it's giving you valuable information. And to Randy's point, yes, you can test this stuff, but some things are, 10 minutes to test. Some things are hours to test, or weeks or months if it's a really big architectural decision. So even though I find fairly often AI doesn't give me something valuable or just gives me what I already know, but doesn't cover the issue, I've been trying to force myself to use it just to try to get an idea of what it looks like when it's wrong and what it looks like when it's right. It's iterating so fast, though, that I'm not sure how much value there is in that theory. I feel like it's iterating
I like it because
than I
it's
can.
like better than going to Stack Overflow and having a sense of the answers are right or not. Because if they're not right, then you go back to Google and you're like, all right, I got to search some more. Where if you're using an AI chatbot to talk with it, you can be like, that's not exactly what I wanted. I don't think this is going to work for these reasons, and it can iterate over what it's responding to.
It's the AI conversation that is most successful for me. So it'll give me a moderately interesting answer that doesn't actually work. And I can say, that doesn't work because X, Y, Z. And it'll say, well, oh yeah, you could do it this way. And I'll say, well, but that way doesn't work because that's obsolete. And I get somewhere with that kind of conversation. It's good.
Yeah.
I like how Randy's interpretation of AI voice is like It's almost like a used car salesman. Like Randy goes in and says, "Hey, I need this," and he goes, "Oh, well, I have this model," and you're like, "Well, that's not going to work." He's like, "Whoa, whoa, whoa! But I have this as well. Here you go." It's very interesting.
That's
I,
good.
I think that's the other side of the coin, though, Randy. That's like a perfect example, because that's the, learning how to use the tool right is also good. Because one thing that I think we've all heard, but until you truly experience it, it's hard to believe, is AI is really good at the documentation, generating that kind of stuff. But when you try to get a specific thing from it, it can't do that. That's one thing that LLMs cannot do. They can't, at least not yet. They can't do specifics. So, for example, you can ask, if we go back to Dolly or something, you can be like, "Hey, Dolly, give me a little icon that indicates time and, has the number 2 on it," and he'll give you something back. But then if you're like, "Oh, you know what? I want that icon again, but move the 2 6 pixels to the right," you're that's an exercise in frustration. You will never get it. You'll get a completely different icon. It will
So
move it,
bad.
put a 5 there. Like, once you start getting explicit, or like, and not general, it fails spectacularly for now. Remember, this is a point in time. I mean, AI is evolving very quickly. So
I
who knows in 6 months?
am, like we all have high hopes, but I find that it seems like some weeks it's way worse than other weeks. You know, it just seems like sometimes it's really, really bad, and other times it's really good. And I don't know I don't know what that is. Do you folks try to use AI for debugging or for evaluating what you've written or what you have, or that kind of usage?
We do a bit, definitely for debugging. I found it helpful. Like, if you have something go wrong on your Drupal site and you go to the watchdog logs and you get that big stack trace of what's happened, or you have the PHP error and you have a long stack trace, like, you can parse through that. But if you copy that text and put it into your AI tool and be like, "Give me in 3 sentences what's going on here," and it can summarize that big bug, like that big error report, and to help direct you. It's not going to solve it for you, but it's gonna be like, "Oh, here's probably what's happening," and that helps speed it up to where to look for the common problem is. But the other place I really like it is for all the Drupal adjacent things that especially development teams use that they may not be experts in. And Randy, I'll use you as an example for this. Like, we use DDev at MIT Sloan, and I'm not an expert in Docker in any way, but if I wanted to add like a new container or something to do like a SAML or something, like, I could, if that doesn't work and I'm struggling with it, I can ask AI like, "Hey, help me do this," or "What's going on? I don't understand this problem." And it can help me with that because I'm not an expert in that, but I need it to do my work. And I think that's where it's really helpful in saving time.
Mike,
I use it that way all the time because I work with so many different languages and technologies all at once, and I can't remember all of them. Like, I had to this week. I had to build a whole compilation routine for all the different MySQL versions so that they would all run in the DDev web server, and you can't just get those out of packages. But I don't know, like CMake. How do you do the right thing with CMake? And I had a long conversation with AI that got me to the right thing with CMake so that I could build all the versions in. It took a long conversation. It wasn't successful right away, but it was good.
Hmm.
So yeah, so using all the other technologies, all the adjacent things to what your core expertise is, great place, because AI is fantastic at syntax. That is where it really screams. It almost always has the syntax right. Whether it's doing the right thing or not, that's a whole different question. But we can't remember the syntax. There's just too many different languages, too many different contexts. We can't remember them all. And AI absolutely knows the syntax.
Mike, I'm wondering, when you're using it to debug, you toss that error message in there. Does it give you, I mean, it gives you back like a synopsis of what the error relates to, but does it also give you like a issue on Drupal.org if it exists, or is it not smart enough to be included in that? Like,
I don't know, it's not smart enough to be included into that, I would say. It's
yeah,
not going to be able to web search, be like, oh yeah, here's the issue for it. Here's a patch file. It's
Well,
not
unless it's
connected
old,
enough.
it might be able to give you. I bet you if you asked it for similar issues, it would.
Yeah.
And that's worth testing.
because I mean that's like, you know, as far as a debugging or a fact finding mission, right? That's like a Google search typically for me as like a portion of the error, and then like, okay,
Mhm.
what D.O issue is like at the top of the list, right? So it'd be
Yeah, but think
interesting.
about if you can use AI to summarize that error for you, and it'd be like, oh, it's probably has to do with the migrate module because of this line here, and you're like, great, let
Right.
me do a Google search for the. It just cuts down that amount of time that
Yeah,
it takes you.
but
Yeah.
I guess my point was like if you could do that, right, and it could synopsize like, hey, it has to do with migrate, and here's an issue that might be relevant, you know, like go check it out, like that. I think that would be kind of helpful.
Going back to, I want to go back to something that we were talking about a little bit earlier. I'm curious if you've seen this in your team or personally, Mike, because this is one of my concerns too. Like when we start to rely on this tool so much, sometimes you miss the obvious error because you're just so used to going to, or like what I've seen people say with like Copilot, the Copilot wait. Like you start typing something, you just wait for Copilot to do it rather than just staying in the flow and working on it. Do you find you or your team are like not looking at the error and trying to figure it at all and just like copying and pasting and waiting for AI to give a response? Or do you think it's still kind of like a second step rather than a first step? Do you think it's a problem if it becomes a first step?
I don't think it's a problem if it becomes a first step. I mean, for me, and this is for every developer individually, right? Their style. For
Yeah.
me, it's a second step because I like to look through and be like, can I quickly determine what's going on here? And if I'm getting stuck, I don't want to waste a bunch of time. So I'll use these tools to help me.
Yeah.
But it's not, I don't think it'd be a problem if AI becomes useful enough where you could default to using that, because we've adjusted to using a whole bunch of tools to aid in our development, like from linters to code completion without AI. Like years ago, we didn't have those, and their holdovers were like, I'm not going to use a linter. I'm going to look through every line of my code to make sure it's structured properly. And it's like, well, why not just use a linter first and let
That
it catch things
reminds
for
me.
you?
That reminds me of an argument I had with a friend of mine last weekend because he primarily codes in Python. And I was like, I know Python. I've used Python. It's a great language, but this is going to start a flame war in the comments probably. But I don't like a language where white space matters. I think it just causes too many problems. And he was saying that it's great because it forces even junior developers to think about their code and write better code. And I'm like, you can use a linter if you care about indentation. Like I write PHP, white space doesn't matter. I'm not pushing if statements with like random indentation because I just lint it before, or even as part of the commit hook. Like it just takes care of it. But the difference is in Python, you can break code because you have 2 extra spaces. Same thing in YAML. Like I think this might change now that recipes are in core. The YAML stuff didn't bother me as much because it's rare that you're writing YAML manually. Like YAML is computer generated, computer consumed usually. The exceptions, of course, in my case personally, are Docker Compose. And like I said, I think with recipes we'll find that we're writing YAML manually a lot more often. But yeah, I think that's a problem too. Like anytime a space can break an entire application, I think it's problematic.
Just
But
so I
anyway,
can put in a moment about Go. In Go, there is only one way to format a file. You don't have to have endless conversations about how the code should be formatted or indented or have 53 tools to make sure that it's right.
Huh. That's an interesting idea. A language that's just like
There's no,
here's how it is.
it's tabbed. It's always done the same way. There is no conversation. Like getting in the PHP world, it's endless.
yeah. Yeah, but I think that's one of the things too. Like not to go down this pathway too far, but like with Go, with Go, even, I imagine you can write it however you want. Then there's like a format key stroke or something that formats it. Like you don't have to, it's essentially linting it for you. It's just easier because there's defined rules for everything. But anyway, let's get back to the show notes.
Talking about AI. You want to get back to that? We can do that.
Yeah.
So, Mike, before we jump over to content generation, which is going to be like, the next 3 hours of conversation, I'm wondering if you or your team have found any best practices for helping you work better with AI. Like, is there something where you're like, oh yeah, you definitely want to make sure like you're doing this as a best practice or that as a best practice?
I mean, the number one I would say is learning prompt engineering and how to write the proper prompts, because right now most of your AI interactions is through prompting, and it's only going to answer in the context you give it. So you have to be able to give it the right context and the right details to get the sort of answers you want. And there's a formula I follow. I didn't come up with it. That has been very, very helpful.
So you're telling me that AI is not smart enough to read between the lines when I say, hey, I want, a picture of a car, to know that my favorite color is green and I probably want that car to be green.
Right. You're going to want to tell it, I want a green car. And then it might give you, a drawing of a car. You're like, I want a photorealistic green car. So you got to learn how to be specific in what you're asking for. So for example, the formula I like to use, it's context plus specific info, then your intent or goal you want to achieve, and then the format you want the response in. So it's like, I'm a Drupal 9 developer and I'm trying to create a content type that does X, Y, or Z. So give me the YAML configuration for it. And that's what it's going to know what to print out for you.
You just finally highlighted for me one of the reasons why I'm not afraid of AI taking my job. Because yes, you can build websites with AI already, but it's that requirement piece that most of the times clients don't have a direct way of determining what that question should be, what that specific should be, without the experience of the architect saying like, well, here are the things you have to consider as part of the use case to make a decision. Whereas if you go to if you go to AI and say, I want a website that has a green banner and something else, and then it might be missing the whole single sign-on application because it's not a question that they new to ask. So even if AI, or even as AI starts to be a tool that's used more, it's not going to replace us, because the part of the value that we bring isn't just the code writing. Part of the value that we bring is how do you translate business requirements into something?
Well, so I mean, yes and no. Like, I agree with you, but I think like there could be a version of like, certain companies could develop their own kind of AI that allows for that kind of back and forth conversation to answer some of those questions, right? And guide you on your path to building that website. I mean, I don't know. I'm not too overly worried about it. And I tend to agree with the sentiment that you just shared, but I think somebody's thinking about it somewhere.
But the problem also, especially if you do client-based work, is clients tell you what they want, but they don't necessarily know what they want, right? Or what they need. So they're going to say, I want a green banner, but that's not actually what they want to achieve. And the AI is going to give them what they asked for in terms of the HTML output. But it's up to you to think through, well, these are the other things you need. And the AI is not going to know to ask those things.
Yep. So is MIT Sloan, I have the perfect segue for this question being that there is none, but is MIT Sloan using AI for content generation at all that you're aware of?
No, we're not. So the MIT Sloan website is really focused on the editorial content we produce based on the research from our faculty. And the editorial team has they're not using AI for generating content. And I think MIT's guidelines also talk about how you're not using AI for generating content that's being put out there, because it's, whatever you use AI to create and you put out there, you have to be sure that it's correct. And I think from a content perspective, that's where you still deal with a lot of hallucinations with AI. And so you have to be really careful with that.
So I want to put a little bit of a finer point on that, because I'm interested in kind of what we talked about at the beginning of the show, where it was like ideation and using it to generate ideas, or like using it to generate kind of that first draft, if you will, right? So not using it, wholesale and just putting it out on the website makes complete sense to me. But I'm wondering, are folks using it? Well, I'll give you an example. I recently wrote a blog post about Starshot. I basically took a pretty robust outline of what I wanted the blog post to cover, dropped it into ChatGPT, said, hey, write me a blog post based on this outline. It did that for me, right? I took the blog post and then I went, line by line, paragraph by paragraph, and I edited it and kind of put it into my own words and so on and so forth, validated facts if they were in there, and then, released it, right? There was a little note at the bottom that said, hey, this was generated with AI, but like, the thoughts here are my own, and so on and so forth. But I'm wondering, like, is that like an acceptable use based on the policies that you guys have? Like, hey, you can use it as a first draft, but like, don't just take it and run with it.
Yeah, I think so. Like, you're allowed to use it for like coming up with like outlines and drafts of content, but you can't have anything that's just AI generated put out as content. Obviously, from like a Drupal perspective, I have no way to validate that one of our content editors didn't use AI to then populate the content of their page. But the policy is like, you can use it for like drafting outlines, or using it as like a thesaurus to be like, oh, how can I make this sound snappier?
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, like, I think, like, I don't know. For me, like, there's always going to be somebody that's just going to type something into, like, type a prompt in and just take it and copy it and use it. And like, obviously that's wrong and seems dumb to me. But I mean, as a first draft tool to say like, oh, well, this is really snappy, right? Like, I like the way this sounds. I'm going to use that, or change this word to that word. Like, that makes a lot of sense to me.
I would say
we have figured out where those 530 different blog posts about Starshot have come from.
I'll say personally, as a reader of blogs, if I see that somebody wrote something with AI, I generally don't continue reading. Only time
that's why I put my notice at the bottom. So once you've read the whole thing, you're like, oh wait.
The only time I've seen somebody use AI that I still felt provided a lot of value was Ivan Stegic's article on, I think, Just Say Drupal. But he did it a little bit differently than you, John. He called out like he wrote the blog post, and there was a section where he said, I asked ChatGPT this prompt and got this information back. Then I modified it this way. And so it wasn't like the outline of the whole thing. It was just like one section, and you could explicitly see what was asked of AI, what came back from AI, and then the value that he added. Whereas when it's something like the language that you said, like, oh, I used it to flesh it out or whatever, when I'm reading it, I have no way of knowing if a particular paragraph, well, first of all, there's a few things. One, I have no way of knowing if a particular paragraph was generated by AI or by the person. Number two, you just told me, John, how much effort you put in going through it. But as a reader, unless I know you personally, I don't know how much you did. And then also, what happens 6 months from now with that like, maybe this time you did it, you spent 2 hours going through it, but maybe 6 months from now, you're just like, oh yeah, this is my tone, and you're just generating and moving on with your day. Like, it just becomes, less valuable. Like, I don't know what's your thoughts and what's not, but that's a personal opinion.
That's valid, but I mean, I think the way I look at it, like, because I was kind of like, I've heavily edited this. Like, I don't necessarily know that it's, just Chat GPT talking now. Like, I definitely don't think it is, right? And I was kind of like, do I really need to put anything on here? But I was like, well, it was used, and like, I validated, I reread, I edited, so on and so forth. So like, I might as well comment on the fact that I used it, right? But yeah, I can see your point as far as like, hey, it may or may not discredit me. I will say, as somebody who, like, I don't know, struggles to get blog posts together, it made it a lot easier to take that outline and say, hey, give me a blog post on this, and then let me edit it down and reword it and structure it more the way that I wanted to. So it made that process a lot faster for me. So I can see that as somebody who's generating content, or quite a bit of content, I can see that as a big time savings for them.
I think there's a difference between you doing it representing yourself versus, like at MIT Sloan, you're representing an institute and the reputation that it's built up.
Yeah,
but
as long as you disclose it.
When you use it as an iterative process to get yourself off the starting block and get something done, that's one of the great things about AI, is it's somebody to talk to. It's as if you had an assistant say, oh yeah, what do we do about this? It's great that way.
Yeah, but I think from my side though is, or the part that I struggle with is, again, not saying John specifically, but just say like just a general blog writer, right? First of all, ChatGPT outputs a lot of content, so on average, the blog post is actually going to be longer. So it's more of an investment of my time. And how am I supposed to evaluate whether investing my time to read that blog is worth it until I've read it? And if it's AI generated, well, I mean, first of all, a person writing a blog could be bad as well, but at least they spend some time and effort putting it together.
That's important.
But if it's just purely AI generated, well, this person might have spent 30 seconds prompting ChatGPT for a 2,000 word essay that I'm not going to realize until the end. I've just spent 20 minutes reading it and it had nothing to say. So like I said, this is explicitly separate from John's personal example right now. But in general, that's one of the reasons why when I see this as AI generated, it's like, well, I don't know how much is AI and how much is actual novel thought. And I'm not going to spend my time doing that because there's plenty of other places I could spend my time.
Now, anyway. I think speaking of that point real quick is where the use of AI for content generation, especially in development and Drupal development, makes sense is for lower level environments and placeholder content, right?
Yeah.
If you're in a situation where you don't want to copy down, specific people information of your users, you can have it generate really quickly, like fake users, fake names and addresses, fake blog posts that are not lorem ipsum that look like real content. You don't care in that case, the content, what the content says, just that it looks like it's real content and that you can test around it.
Or even like cataloging things. I think that's a valid use case. Like if you write the article and then you use AI to like determine the set of tags for the
keywords,
page. Yeah, that kind of stuff. Or even, personally, I'm starting to get a little sick of seeing AI generated imagery, right? Because it kind of all looks the same, but also it's better than before where there was no image, right? Like people can't spend, hundreds of dollars or tens of hours generating completely unique thumbnails for every single blog post. Yeah, now almost every blog post has some AI generated something or other, but it's more interesting than nothing. So like I've gotten used to that. And I'm not going to, and again, it's just like a quick thing like, oh, that's an interesting thumbnail, read the blog post. But when the blog post is AI generated, it's a question of, am I getting something novel and genuine, or am I getting something that's just being regurgitated from AI? And there's no
using
way to
it for generating alternative text for images. Like there's the automatic alternative text module available that it's not going to be perfect. But if you put that in place, so when someone uploads an image, like an editor uploads an image and it provides that descriptive text that gives them a starting place, they're more likely to fix it versus taking the time to write a really bad description of an image that's not going to be helpful for people who use assisted devices.
Yeah, exactly.
So Mike, one of the things that you listed was technical explanations as a classic important thing. What's an example about how you use AI for technical explanation?
So it goes two ways. One is if I'm in a scenario where I need to explain a really technical thing to non-technical stakeholders to be like, this is why we're going to have challenges, moving to layout builder from paragraphs or something. I can write that out to AI, like in my technical developer speak, and say, hey, explain this to me like in plain English, and they can help me iterate over how I'm going to explain a real technical concept to a non-technical audience. In the same way also is if I'm dealing with legacy code or code from if I'm looking at a contrib module that's not working correctly for me and I don't understand like what their class is doing, I can copy that and have the AI tool. I can ask it like, explain to me what this function's doing, and it can help explain that to me so I can understand it quicker. I like to use it for those reasons. And then on the flip side, I think for people who work with Drupal developers or Drupal team and they want to explain what they want to have achieved, people don't always explain things great. So they could say, help me explain this in a more technical, detailed way, that we want to do X, Y, and Z in Drupal. And it can help with that.
Do you use it to like explain a block of code or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, that's mainly for having it explain it to me when I don't understand what the block of code is doing. Because it's like, say you ever come across those functions that are like 200 lines long. You're just like, I can't follow all this logic to understand what's going on. Like highlight it and say, Copilot, explain to me what this function is doing. And it's going to parse through it and tell you.
Can you generate the doc blocks then for that? So like it will figure out like the return types and all that kind of stuff too?
Yep.
Oh, nice.
And there's even tools, we've played with it a little bit. It wasn't as great as I was hoped, but in generating pull requests, there's like a tool called What the Diff. There's a bunch of them available where it will look at the diffs of your pull request and it'll write the description of your pull request to say like, here's what's changed. I mean, it doesn't give context about why you're changing something, but it's like, yeah, we've changed it here and here, and this is now doing this, which is helpful to start it in that way.
It's so funny because this brings me back to, like I said, when we were talking about the module of the week, we're using that module of the week for a project to help us parse some documents and get that information into a dashboard that can be validated by people and put in. And one of the big concerns that I've had and discussed with the client multiple times is like, what happens if something goes wrong? What happens if AI makes stuff up, or just misses something entirely? And first of all, in our experimentation, it sometimes misses things, but we haven't seen it actually, like with the prompts we have, it hasn't made stuff up because all the questions are like, list something that's in this file. So I think that concern is mostly alleviated. But the truth is, if it's missing things, humans can do that too. Mm-hmm. And when humans are reading or doing something repetitive, like reading document after document after document and trying to pull some information out, especially after the third, fourth, fifth document, humans will very, very quickly start to miss things or make mistakes or skim. Whereas AI is going to be just as diligent on the last one as the first one. And then, of course, we're going to build some tools to, like I said, validate this kind of stuff and mark things as, this was generated so you could, or has been verified by a human, that kind of thing. But it's interesting because when you bring up that PR description, my first question is like, well, what if it misses something and doesn't describe something key? Well, the truth is, I miss stuff when I'm writing my PR descriptions all the time. And then I look at the changes and go, oh, wait, I can, like when I'm writing release notes or something, like, oh my God, like part of my process for writing release notes for clients is look at the commit messages, look at the pull requests, look at the changes and make sure I didn't miss something, right? And, I'd say most of the time, everything is already in the pull request, but not an insignificant amount of times do I look at a change request or, not a change request, a ticket or something like, oh yeah, we did this too. This is going out and I have to add it to the release notes. So even if AI misses it, it's not like humans are not going to miss it as well.
Yeah, I mean, so it's a tool, right? So if it helps you and it speeds those things up, so then you can spend more time looking like, oh, this was missed, but it cuts out that big amount of time you have to spend gathering all that data together. That's just helpful.
Exactly.
So, Mike, in closing here, looking into the future of AI within Drupal, what do you think it looks like? And as an example, do you think like AI is gonna replace Drupal developers someday?
No, I don't think AI is going to replace Drupal developers. It's a tool for developers to use. It's going to change. It's definitely going to change the way Drupal developers work and how we build Drupal sites. but Drupal's too complex of a system. I mean, it can generate YAML for web forms, but it's not, you can't tell it, build me a whole Drupal site that does X, Y, and Z. It's not going to know how, like, because there's so many steps you have to do in Drupal to install modules and to generate the config files that then have to run through the config hooks. AI is not going to run that for you. It's not going to be able to generate the database for you or the config files for you fully. So I think it's just going to change how we do our work.
Do you? Yeah. So I just came off of a call earlier this morning about recipes, and I'm wondering, like, in the frame of like future AI, do you think there'll be a possibility where you could say to an AI, "Hey, build me a Drupal site using this recipe and this theme," and have it, like, you know, basically provide you the code base that has all of those things ready to go?
Yeah, potentially. I think of it, it would be a cool use case in the future for, if you remember Drupal console, when that was around for a little while, like you could have these interactive terminal prompts for building out your Drupal site or like a module. And so having it more of a tool like that, like I need a site that will have will have web form and will have X, Y, and Z, and it can produce like the default code for you to then just run the install. I think we see that happening.
It's actually kind of funny because one of the things that Drupal Droid has had me doing is it helped me rediscover Drush's generate functionality. And I've been, because one of the things I used GPT for a lot was generating boilerplate code. And it was great. But then I forget what it was. I was trying to generate something, maybe single directory components. And it couldn't quite do it yet, probably because the documentation wasn't up to date yet. And when I was looking around, I found out that Drush had a generate command for single directory components. So I generated them. And then I went to generate a service. And so I went to ChatGPT and it was like, wait a second. I wonder if Drush has that, because I had stopped using it for a while. And then sure enough, Drush has plenty of generator functions for all sorts of things. And so I've actually started using that way, way more again recently. So I'll still use GPT sometime. I think on the code side, more often I'll use it for something you mentioned earlier, which is like, hey, I have the CSS block. Can we make it more efficient? Or I have this like nested if else statement that I was going, just prototyping something. Can you flatten it a bit or something, that kind of thing. But Drush has a really robust generator function. So if that's not something you've used, it might be worth looking at again.
And I think people will see, and my prediction in the future, of a more AI-based Drupal admin experience as people get used to having these more interactive prompts. Like instead of us having to know to go to like structure, content types, where to go, you can type in like, hey, I want to go and add a field to my article content type. And it'd be like, all right, yeah, here's a link to go that part of the Drupal admin.
Feels like Coffee Module 2.0.
Yeah.
Question, follow up on the AI future of Drupal thing. Any plans to update Drupal Droid to allow for maybe some of this site creation functionality?
I mean, I can only control it as much as ChatGPT lets me basically pre-prompt everything. So if you ever use the Drupal Droid on ChatGPT, it's basically I've wrote a pre-prompt that goes in front of every prompt you give it that sets up the context for things. So yeah, if possibly.
I know most people probably wouldn't like this, but I would love it if you would update it to just always talk to me like an expert and never ask for confirmation.
Well, I specifically told it
brief and don't give me a confirmation.
I specifically told it to, unless someone says write code for me, to always ask to confirm what it thinks you want, because that's one of the things is like it can be hard to understand that. So I told it like always confirm what the person asked you and reiterate it back so that you as a person using it be like, no, that's not what I'm talking about, or yeah, that's what I'm talking about, to know that
maybe we need a
gave it the right context.
Maybe we need a Drupal Droid Advanced.
Yeah.
or what's it called? Wait, what's that programming style called? Like Go Ninja programming?
We just need to be like Go and just take the tool how it is and use it to the best of your ability.
It's a meme type of. Yeah, where it just gives you a response waiting for you to finish typing.
Okay, we've gone off the rails here. It's at this point of the show that, Mike, I thank you for joining us and talking to us about all of this fun AI stuff.
Yeah, it's been fun to talk about it. Thank you so much for having me again.
Yeah, thanks for coming back. Do you have any questions or feedback? You can reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal, or by email with show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and other listeners on Drupal Slack and the Talking Drupal channel.
You can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal. Learn more at talkingdrupal.com/tdpromo.
And you can get the Talking Drupal newsletter to learn more about our guest hosts, show news, upcoming shows, and much more. You can sign up for the newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
And thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choosing that Become a Patron button in the sidebar. Okay, Mike, if folks wanted to get a hold of you and chat about AI or any of the other things that you're doing, how could they go about doing that?
You could find me at mike-miles.com or all over the internet at mikemiles86, so Drupal.org or LinkedIn. Those are my usernames.
Here you go. Randy Fay, what about you?
I'm easy to find on the. I'm usually RFay, RFAY, and I'm on the Drupal Slack, especially the DDev channel. DDev Discord is a good place. Randy Fay on Twitter X, and Randy Fay a couple of places, but you can find me pretty easily everywhere.
Great. Nick Laughlin?
You can find me pretty much everywhere at Nixvan, N-I-6-V-A-N.
And I'm John Picozzi. You can find me on all the major social networks and Drupal.org at John Picozzi, and you can find out more about EPAM at EPAM.com.
And if you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking. See you guys next week.
Thanks, everyone. Talk to you later.